I've been in this program for about a month now. I think it will be by next Monday should be 1 month exactly. And today I'm hosting this webinar. And I'm going to first give you a background about Microverse. So Microverse is a program for remote software developers that's completely free until you get a job. We have different courses in our program, ranging from data structures and algorithm, HTML and CSS, JavaScript, React, Redux, Ruby, and Ruby on Rails. We basically go to school full time, usually from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. every day. And we each have coding partners that is also remote. And we work with our partners through this pair programming ideology. And we support each other until we both get a job. So it's basically a commitment, actually. Every couple of weeks, we organize programs like this, rightly called Launch and Learn, and with speakers like Daniel Lew here. The goal is to inspire our students by giving them different perspective from professional software developers who are either freelancers or working in cool companies or also working remotely, which is the idea of Microverse. We've also opened this launch and learn to the general public. So it's not just Microverse students that are here. Others that are not Microverse students are also here. I hope to inspire others from these launch and learns. Anyway, today we have Daniel Lew here with us. Thank you very much, Daniel Lew, for joining us. And he's going to be talking on the importance of developers community. Over to you now, Daniel Lew.
Yeah, do you want me to get started now?
Yes, you can start now.
All right, let us open the slides. Great, is this all working? You can see the slides, not that they're that critical to this talk. So yeah, I was invited to come here, talk a little about like my own personal story and how that might, help others. And I chose to speak about the importance of developer communities. I'm Dan Lew. I work at Trello right now. I've been doing development for about 12 years. And as people getting into the industry, I feel like this is the sort of thing I did initially is I got a job. I went into an office and I worked, and that was pretty much it. And I didn't really interact with any developer community outside of just the people who are immediately working around me. And I'm here to say that the developer community is great, and I think you should get involved with it. And here's essentially my story of how I got involved with the developer community as a whole. And by the way, drawing this picture is like a bunch of Google developer experts took a picture at one point. I'm theoretically somewhere in this photo. I didn't bother trying to find where it was because I think I was far in the back, probably out of this, cut out of that. So really my first exposure to the wider programming community was through Stack Overflow. So I entered the workplace around 2007, and that was actually before Stack Overflow existed. You had to go to Experts Exchange if you wanted to get questions and answers, and Experts Exchange was not a particularly community-friendly site because they typically paywalled everything that you actually wanted to see there. But Stack Overflow launched in about 2008, and it was great for me because at the time I really didn't like my job, and so I thought it was way more fun to go on Stack Overflow and try to get points and answer people's questions. So maybe not the greatest way to get started involving shirking my duties at work in order to just go help other people at their work. But I found it to be a lot of fun, and it kind of helped me get through that year before I realized I should probably quit my job and move on to something else. So in terms of like what the community is getting out of this, I mean, the benefits of Stack Overflow as a whole have been immense, which is that just so much knowledge has been shared through Stack Overflow. But really, like, that's not like, even if you're just sticking on Stack Overflow and answering questions, you yourself end up learning a lot. Like, just trying to answer the questions correctly, you end up kind of solidifying your knowledge. This is maybe something you've you've seen before when you try to teach someone anything, really. As the teacher, you end up learning quite a bit as well. You're obviously not learning the exact same thing that people you're teaching, but you kind of like, okay, I have this vague hand-wavy notion of how this code works. But when I try to explain to someone else, then it kind of really makes me re-examine exactly how that all set up. The other cool thing about going on Stack Overflow all the time, it made me look way smarter than I actually am, because you can answer questions and get a bunch of points, and people would like kind of say like, oh, look at how many points Dan has, even though like the vast majority of my points came from like stupid answers that I wrote. But the end result of that was that ultimately, like my current job, I actually got through Stack Overflow jobs, which was, I think it was called Stack Overflow Careers at the time. So that was like a huge benefit to me. And then the last personal benefit I got out of Stack Overflow is that I have actually answered my own questions on it. So I remember there was some question around how to use Google Maps on Android, and I just had this inkling in the back of my head, like I know that there's a way to do this, I just don't remember how to do this. I ended up Googling, how do you do X? And I came up with a Stack Overflow answer. I was like, great, here's the answer I needed. And I went to the answer, and it was actually myself who had answered it like from 5 years previous, which is sort of embarrassing, but that happens. So that was kind of my introduction to developer communities. And a cool element of this is that it's all online. You don't actually have to travel anywhere to do this sort of developer communities. Because programming is so internet-based these days, you don't have to go out, which is good for the Microverse crowd because it's a lot of remote programmers, is my understanding. The second kind of internet-based thing I did was blogging. So I ended up starting a blog. This is an old version of the blog, kind of how it looked like back when I first started in 2009. And what this came out of was this sort of realization when I first got into Android. I'd run into some difficult problem on Android. I'd have no idea how to solve it. And I would just start typing into Google, like, how do I solve X? So like, how do I dynamically retrieve resources in Android? And at the time, Android was very small, and there weren't that many people working on it. And so maybe like a third of the time, you'd get a result. And the other 2/3 of the time, you wouldn't get a result, and I would just have to try to figure this out on my own. But what I realized was that 1/3 of the time that you get a result, like, someone had to have written that. Someone took the time not only to solve that problem, but also then to share the solution to that problem. And I kind of created this ethos ever since then, which is like, if I ever have a problem where I feel like I can't find it on Google anywhere, there's just no solution on the internet, no one's ever publicly disclosed how to solve this, that I should do that. And this has been really great. One, again, because when you try to share your knowledge, you end up solidifying your own knowledge of it. Again, people think you're way smarter than you are, even though what you're essentially doing is just like, I worked for a week on this problem, and now I have more knowledge than I used to, and I can write that up. But people are like, oh my God, his person just knows how these answers work. They don't see all that time that was put in behind it. And then it also lifts everyone up because people Google these questions. There's so many developers out there that pretty much whatever problem you're running into, probably someone else has run into it at some point too. That's what Stack Overflow really showed. I like blog posts especially because it allows you to like tell a story behind a problem and really get into the meat of it. That's like Stack Overflow is more for direct question and answer. Blog posts can be more story based, and it also has a very long tail of knowledge sharing. So like things I've written 10 years ago, people can still go back and read now, and maybe half the time it's still good stuff. So that's something I've kept up until now. Stack Overflow I tend to only use when I'm getting into new platforms, but blogging I'm still doing on a regular basis. Before I move on to the next thing, I saw notes about Q&A. Are there questions to answer? I see a Q&A section. I'm going to take a break. What do you think about the rubber duck method of explaining concepts? So rubber duck programming is this idea where you take a rubber duck, you put it on your desk, and when you're having a problem, you talk to the rubber duck and try to explain the problem to the rubber duck. And there's a shocking number of times that this works to solve the problem. because as you are speaking to the rubber duck, you realize, oh, somehow the act of just speaking it out loud made a difference. That's why the rubber duck is a stand-in for another person, because if you go speak to another person, you feel really dumb if like 2/3 of the way through asking your question, you're like, actually, wait, I got an answer. Never mind, bye. So I think it's great. I don't know that it is so helpful for like explaining concepts to others. It's more helpful for just trying to get a grasp on something yourself. All right. The next thing I got involved with the community is local meetups. So one of the major local meetups that I've been a part of has been the Google Developer Group in the Twin Cities, because that's around where I live. And I don't honestly remember why exactly I got into this. I think probably when I got into Android, I was just Googling like, Android help, and found an Android user group in the Twin Cities. The Android user group eventually getting subsumed by the Google Developers Group. And I started attending. It's all local meetups. Generally, I've never heard of one costing money. They're free. I don't know what the culture is like in other parts of the world, but in the US, usually meetups have some food involved with it too. So like it's a nice evening. You can go out, get some free food, listen to someone speak. Some of these, you just hang out and like talk with other people. But it's really great because then you get to know a bunch of developers in your area that are interested in things you're also interested in, but don't directly work with you. And it's cool because then it actually creates a real sense of community. If you go to a bunch of events, you start seeing the same people, you become friends with them, you hang out with them elsewhere. It's a great way to share knowledge, because if you meet other people in person, maybe all of your immediate coworkers didn't have an idea for how to solve a problem, but like, some random person at a meetup will have a good answer for that. Then they have talks, those talks can be informative. And then on top of all that, like it can be a good way to network and find jobs essentially. Because, if you're just stuck at your one office job, you're not going to be meeting a bunch of people who potentially could hook you up a new job. But if you meet, a dozen people every other week at random local meetups, one of them, people are almost always hiring at these things. Usually the people who sponsor it, the reason they sponsor the meetup is like because they want people they want to show off how great their space is, and they want people to apply there. So it can be very beneficial. And once you've done local meetups, there's another level above that, which are conferences. This is a huge this picture is from Google I/O, which is a gigantic conference. But there's conferences of all varying sizes, from like 50 people to thousands of people. And conferences I kind of went to for the same reason as meetups, which is I sort of felt like, oh, this is just a thing one is supposed to do, I guess. Not really knowing the benefits going in, but it turns out there are some very good benefits from attending conferences, especially when you first start getting into development. So when you attend a conference, usually it's just a bunch of talks, and then maybe some vendor booths as well. The talks, when you first are learning how to program or get into the world of programming, every one of them is chock full of like 100 amazing ideas. 10 years later after attending conferences, the pickings get a little more slim because the talks you kind of start recognizing like the same concepts coming out of talks over and over again. That's fine. But like when you're first getting into development, it's so incredibly beneficial. On top of that, conferences are large enough that people tend to actually travel for them. And so the local meetups, you meet people in the local area, that's great. If you're actually traveling to a conference and a bunch of other people are, you can get like really good knowledge from people all across the country. And usually the sort of people who are traveling for these are the people who are going to have a lot of knowledge to share. And who knows, you can even meet someone where it's like, this person's really cool, their company's really cool, I want to go work for them, and maybe end up moving to where they're at to get a job. So tons of knowledge sharing. You learn a ton, especially at first. You can connect with a bunch of people. I remember in particular, one of the first conferences I ever attended was a AndevCon in San Francisco, and I just met a bunch of random people, and one of them ended up being like, some of them I know now still, and some of them I haven't met again since. But like a couple of them in particular, I'm still friends with, and if they ever roll through town, I'll go out to dinner with them and whatnot. So it's just, you never know. Like this thing I went to 9 years ago is still kind of paying off now. So conferences, meetups, attending it is great. For me personally, after going to a few of them, I said, I want to see what it's like going to a conference from the other side. Instead of just being in the audience, I want to be on the speaker's side of things. So that's when I got into speaking at conferences. So the way that you typically do this, there are no rules around this. It's something that I feel like people don't necessarily understand at first. They see the speakers and they think, oh, there must be all this organization around it. There are no rules. You just come up with what you want to speak. You pitch it to the conference organizers. You see if they want to accept you to go up and talk about that for a while. So I got into speaking because I wanted to see this side of the thing. I started at my local meetup. Local meetups are a great place to do talks. Usually they're pretty starved for people to actually get up and speak for 30 or 40 minutes. Although I think my first talk was like 15 minutes long. It doesn't have to be anything immense either. And again, in the same way that like blogging and Stack Overflow are very beneficial, it's super beneficial trying to write a talk. It really solidifies your knowledge of whatever you're trying to talk about, especially because nowadays everything's recorded and you don't want to get up and say something really dumb. So you end up spending, a bunch of extra hours verifying that what you're actually saying is correct. So I went to speak at local conferences, meetups. I started speaking at conferences. Speaking at conferences have even more benefits. For one thing, a lot of conferences will pay for your travel. Like conferences have varying amounts of money that they'll pay for speakers. Some of them don't pay anything. At this point, I kind of avoid those because like an hour-long talk for me can take upwards of 20, 30 hours for me to prepare. So that's a lot of free work to be giving away for nothing. But at this point, like if they pay for me to travel, that's great because I'll just be like, oh, there's a conference out in like, I live in the US. There's a conference out in Copenhagen. I'll certainly go speak in Copenhagen because I'd like to go visit Copenhagen if they would pay for the travel. So that's like can be a great benefit. The other cool thing is that as a speaker at a conference, there tends to be like a speaker dinner where you just get to hang out with the other speakers, and like the speakers are the coolest people. Like I love hanging out with them. The one commonality between all speakers is that they like to talk about stuff, and so you can learn so much just hanging out with a group of speakers. You don't need to be a speaker to hang out with them, by the way. Like just go hang out with them after whatever talk you thought was really impressive. But it's very easy in if you happen to also be a speaker. Another benefit, kind of common again with like blogging and Stack Overflow, people think you know way more than you know. Usually the talks that I give are very narrow about some very particular topic, and people think that if you gave a good talk about X, you probably know about the entire rest of the alphabet, even though you really don't. And then also it has like other side benefits. Like there's this program called the Google Developer Expert Program. It gets me tickets to go to Google I/O. I like all of this stuff, but I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't been like going out blogging and speaking and what have you. I'm going to take another break and look at the Q&A. Have I ever done a TED Talk? I have not ever done a TED Talk. So my talks are very like technical in nature, just like very much so about programming. To me, TED Talks are more about like some grand idea that you have. I don't really have any grand ideas. Most of my ideas are about like, how do you make RxJava work a little bit better or something like that. So let's see here, what's next on my list? And then so like the last way I've really gotten involved in the community is open source. And all of these ways I've gotten involved have kind of built on top of each other. So open source code is great. I got into it mostly through Android because when I started working on Android, I realized it was really useful being able to see Android source code when I was debugging things. And that's cool. And then I realized like, oh, I can use libraries and I can see how those open source libraries are working, and that also helps me. And then the next evolutionary step of that is, oh, there's a bug in this open source library, I want to add some new feature to it, I can actually contribute. And that's great too. So it kind of had that evolutionary step, and it helped a lot going to meetups and conferences, because then at those meetups and conferences, I would meet the people who actually had written those libraries or those open source code and be like, hey, let's talk. Where do you think the library is headed? Would you accept my code if I gave it to you? Sometimes what happens in open source is that people will just kind of come up with an idea and send you the code to absorb into your library, and you'd be like, well, actually, that's kind of not what the point of the library is for, and then you feel bad because like they did all this work, but it's not really work that you can accept into the library. So it's good to like talk to them ahead of time. It helps to know them ahead of time. At the very least, you can get started in open source by just open sourcing your little side projects and putting them on GitHub or Bitbucket. People, like, it used to be that in order to have these things be free, they had to all be public. That's not the case anymore. Everyone's made it so that you can have free private repos. But still, like, even if you had to make them public, it wasn't really a big deal because people fear putting their code out there and that someone will see it and say that this code is bad and then like make fun of them or something. The reality is that no one will care about your code for the most part. Like, if you just put out your random side projects publicly, probably very, very few people will actually read it, much less dig into it and like try to get it to work or have any critiques whatsoever. So just having your code out there is fun. So in terms of the benefit for the community, everyone gets code. It's sort of like that rising tide lifts all boats thing. Personally, you get the free code. You can also contribute back to it. One of the great benefits of creating an open source library, so I've authored a couple open source libraries at this point for Android, is that you get other people contributing to it. And it's not even necessarily that they're contributing code. That's somewhat of a misconception, is that people think, oh, because it's open source, other people are going to be contributing code. They might just be contributing like feedback. So they might say like, hey, this API is kind of awkward. Can you fix it? And you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about how awkward it is, but you're right. Like, this other way of doing it might be better. Or they'll point out bugs to you and you'll be like, oh, shoot, I haven't run into that bug personally, but that definitely could have bitten me at some point, and now I will go fix it. But just being informed of that is even a benefit. And then people also use open source just to like increase brand of like your company, of yourself as a developer, what have you. I go to the QA again, see here. When it comes to open source, do you think it could impact? Oh, there's a bunch of questions. Sorry, I feel like I've been missing some. Okay, let me just go from the bottom up. When it comes to open source, do you think it could impact different things other than programming? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the question. I guess, but I'm not sure. Like, open source is source code, so to me it is just all about programming. But I guess there could be some implications about having code out there. Do you intentionally plan time between blogging and work? No. And I was going to get into that later. I actually just find writing fun, and I just like the whim takes me every once in a while. I'm like, I really want to write about X, and then I just spend a few hours writing about it, and that's pretty much the only reason I write. If I didn't find it fun, I wouldn't be doing it at all. What is an example of a friendship you have developed from one of these community meetups? Oh, there are so many. I was referencing one in particular, but I might as well name him because he wouldn't care. But like, Mike Wolfson is one of the people I met like 9 years ago at some conference, and he was just another Android developer hanging out. And it was fun to hang out with him. Not too much more came of it at that time. And then a couple years later, I seeing him at more and more conferences. We still hang out and whatnot. Years past that, and he lives in Arizona. Like, he's 1,000 miles away from me. A couple years after that, the Google starts its Google Developer Expert Program. That's when I like find out that like, oh, he's like kind of a big player in it. And through knowing him, it's easy. It's like significantly easier for me to like get a reference to join that program. And like, how would I have known like 5 years in advance that I should have met this person to hang out with him, to like have these relationships further down the line? You wouldn't know. So it's just great to go out and kind of have these serendipitous moments. And still now, like, he works for a company that is located near where I live, and so he travels here every once in a while. We'll still go out and get dinner and have a great time. Do you have any suggestions on side projects for new developers? I don't have any specific topics that I would suggest, but for me, it's always about just like the desire to complete something. So it's like, if there's something that is bothering you and you really want to fix, that's what I would do. I get by far the most mileage out of that. Like, I wrote some silly little Android app many years ago that just like, I play a lot of board games. I didn't like any of the apps for picking who would go first when you play board games. So I just wrote like a who goes first picker app, and that was fun. Like I learned a couple things even just from writing that simple little app, and that's the sort of project I'd say is like find some personal itch and scratch that. So those are the ways that, open source, speaking, blogging, going to meetups and conferences, answering questions on Stack Overflow. Those are all the ways that I've been involved in the community. But I don't want to leave out, like, there are tons of other ways to get involved that I personally have not gotten involved. That is what I have outlined is not at all exhaustive of all the options. So there's huge parts of it that I haven't touched at all because I'm just personally not interested in doing it myself, but I have a lot of respect for the people who do. Whoops, slides are bouncing around a little. So like organizing conferences, organizing meetups, that's huge. Like this picture here is of DroidCon. Oh, I don't know why this keeps sliding around. So this picture here is of DroidCon, and this needs dozens of volunteers. Like, do you think that this room and this computer setup and all the people there and having chairs for the audience and recording equipment, like that all doesn't come out of a void? Someone needs to organize all that. And I have so much respect for the people who love organizing conferences. I could never do it. My wedding was enough organizing events for my entire life. But more power to you if you want to get involved that way. If you don't want to get involved in the organizational level, volunteers are always welcome at these things. So just people to help out, maybe like man the check-in booth so that people can get checked in, or people to like help out with the technical issues in various rooms. You can help doing fundraising. So if you can go within your company and get people, convince them to like sponsor local events so that they can actually happen, that's a way you can get involved in the community. And so much more. I mean, I wish I had written down more options here, but that's like the three that came to mind immediately for me. But there's so many ways to get involved in the community beyond just what I've talked about. So kind of in conclusion, I wanted to sum up like some of the common themes of like getting involved in the community. The main thing to me that the community represents is just a huge amount of knowledge sharing. Sharing knowledge is great. It has never, ever bitten me that I've shared some knowledge with other people. And I don't think it really does bite people that this ever happens. Like people understand that like we're all programmers, we're all in it together, we're all trying to make each other better. Usually you're not going to get some edge by keeping some programming thing in your head just for you. Maybe at the level of like search engine algorithms, but not at the level of like basic programming skills. The more involved you get in the community, because it's all about knowledge sharing, the more knowledge you end up gaining. And that's more knowledge just from learning from other people or from you yourself contributing and trying to learn more so that you can contribute. And then on top of that, on a personal level, the more involved you are, the more you become well known within a community. And that just becomes easier to get support in the future or to get a job in the future. So it's not just like this selfless act either. I want to admit that. Like you can end up becoming better known and people will like you and want to give you jobs. So it's definitely something that can be personally beneficial as well. Another thing I want to note in conclusion is that I am, by many metrics, way too involved in the developer community. Like I spend a fair amount of time writing blog posts, writing talks, and the only reason I can do this is because I find it fun. This isn't something that, in order to be a programmer, you have to do any of this. In fact, you can do none of this if you want to. I think it's beneficial to at least get involved a little bit, at least go to maybe some local meetups and meet other people. But by no means am I saying like, hey, here's a template for your life and here's what you must be doing. You must get involved in open source. You must go speak. No. Like that's just stuff I do because I find it fun and I find myself able to carve out time for it. Just embracing the community in small ways, though, can be beneficial. So that's pretty much what I had to say. Let me go through Q&A, the rest of the Q&A that we have here. How could a small community attract expert or professional developers? That is a good question. it might to some extent be impossible. Like if you're in a town of like 10,000 people, it might be really hard to get someone there. One of the ways that you can get someone to come out is to give them money. That's the easy answer. That's actually part of what the Google Developer Expert Program was about, was saying like, hey, if we know that someone's a good speaker, Google does not have many developers in, let's say, Turkey, but we know that there's some good Turkish Android programmers and there's a Turkish community meetup going on. What if we pay for their airfare to go to this meetup? Then it becomes much more possible for them to actually go there. But to some extent, this is why we have conferences that are big and located in big cities, is because it's easier to get a bunch of expert professional people together in one all at once, rather than trying to attract like individuals to a smaller community. Does being a better writer make you a better programmer? Is the opposite true? I have no idea. I've never given that any thought. My gut reaction to that question is yes. I think that a lot of programming is like, oh, I'm getting some feedback from someone, I think. All right. Feedback issues. In a lot of ways, I find that programming is about being able to explain what's going on, essentially, like explain in your own head how to get from point A to point Z. And writing is much the same way. Like writing is all about, a convincing essay or a story is all about how do you flow from this thing to the next thing. But I honestly haven't given it that much thought, so I don't have much more to say on that. Is sharing ideas big or small beneficial as sharing knowledge as well? Definitely. I was just watching another talk from a speaker that I love a lot, Rich Hickey. He's the author of Closure. He's always he's always going out and speaking about like big ideas that he hasn't even necessarily implemented yet, things he might be working on. But just these ideas out there can like kind of spark little thoughts in other people's heads and make them go off and do really cool things. The big worry that people have with sharing ideas is that like someone's going to take my idea and like make their big successful startup out of it. I've not ever found that really to be the case. There's this really, I can't remember the name of the paper now, but there's this really great paper about like how it's not always the first person on market who is going to be the winner. And they made this sarcastic joke about like, how Google is so successful now because they were the first search engine. They were not the first search engine by a long shot, but they were successful because they were so much better than everyone else. And so like putting ideas out there, if you don't have time to do it yourself, why not put it out there? Maybe someone else will make it. Are there any unwritten rules for sharing? I mean, the main unwritten rule I'd say is don't share out company secrets. So like if you are working at Google and you're working on proprietary algorithms, maybe don't write about those proprietary algorithms unless you have permission from legal to actually do that. Otherwise, not really. I think an unwritten thing for me is I try to be relatively positive. This is not true of the community as a whole. Some people love to write blog posts about how much programming language X sucks in this way or the other. That can be useful in terms of like pushing us all forwards, but in general, like I try to stay positive because I think that people like that more. So anyways, was I using Alta Vista on the Netscape browser? Oh yes, definitely. Alta Vista, and then I think I was using Dogpile for a while. A Dogpile, I think it was like would like combine the search results of 5 different search engines or something like that. Before someone told me about this cool new thing called Google. Cool. Well, if there's no more questions, is that it or?
Hi everyone.
Hi.
There's one more question actually. Open source seems to be the rave of the moment. Do you think this leaves room for substandard products? And also, are there ways to make cash from open source?
Let's see here. I'm not sure I understand the context of this question.
Maybe Noryude, maybe Raphael would like to ask you directly.
Like substandard in that it's easy, it makes it too easy to build something bad off of open source libraries, or
Hi, Daniel.
hi.
Yeah, what I was saying is everyone is talking about open source now, and I know that a lot of companies are jumping into open source, like they are making their products more and more open source. And even emerging developers, like new developers, they feel like the best way to get yourself out in the market is to create an open source product, right? I think Google throws a lot of endorsement on open source products these days, but I think this leaves room for people just creating substandard programs probably programs that do not function properly, or programs that could break easily and just push out there in the name of open source. Don't you think that's a problem?
Uh, I don't think it's certainly a possibility. Like someone here is like, oh, the way to get ahead is to write an open source library. So they write an open source library that it doesn't really do anything or something like that. That certainly can happen. I don't think it's actually a problem though, because like I said earlier, just because you put code out there doesn't mean anyone actually reads it. So people can put out as many substandard open source projects as they want to, but it's very possible that no one ever reads any of that stuff. And that people just stick to the well-written, well-known open source projects. And in terms of making money on open source, that is a big open question right now. I definitely don't want to step into trying to answer that question. So I have no idea.
Okay.
Okay, we seem to be, okay, we have another question from Luis Sanchez. Native versus hybrid. What are your thoughts about tech like React, Native, and Flutter?
I think I don't know that I have too much of an opinion on them yet. I'm a native developer. I've been a native developer for a long time because basically to get the performance that I wanted and to get the exact features I wanted, you really have to go as close as possible to the actual Android framework. But React Native is very interesting because it's not super far away from the framework. It still gets all those performance benefits that you want. And I think it's probably a pretty good option for if you want to do cross-platform development, if you want to just be able to write. I mean, we're never going to get to the panacea of write once, run everywhere. You still need to do platform-specific code just because that's always what ends up happening. But I think it can be a decent option. I just haven't explored it too much myself. So.
Okay, so Cinemer, he asks, if I was to create a learning book on economics, would making it open source and putting it on GitHub be super beneficial?
I think it depends on what your goal is. And if your goal is to make money, making it free probably would not be very beneficial. Although you never know. Like some people put their stuff. There was a programming book I read about Haskell called Learn Your Haskell. It's completely free, but he still sells it, and I assume people are buying it. I don't really know too much because I've never gotten into the writing books thing. Certainly putting it out there for free, and if people like it, would be very beneficial to you as a person being known. I know people even who've written books where it's not free, it's not open source or anything like that. It's just a book they published. It still brings them some amount of prestige to have that book out there. So.
Okay, well, we have a lot of time left. Does anyone want to ask Daniel something directly? Does anyone want to raise their hand and ask? No? No more questions?
Amen. In the meantime, I think we can ask Daniel about Stack Overflow. So since Daniel talked about answering questions on Stack Overflow, like going to Stack Overflow, I'm thinking for a new developer, right? Obviously, you do not have the technical skills to answer questions on Stack Overflow, right? So, and from the few times I've gone to Stack Overflow, it could sometimes you get pretty out of it, like you feel left out easily. You could ask a question and then you see someone just downvotes your question or tells you that this. I think that's a push away. How would you advise new developers to approach Stack Overflow in order to reap some of the benefits you have from Stack Overflow?
Yeah, that's a really hard problem. I feel like that's like the central problem that Stack Overflow has been having to deal with for the last decade, is how to keep the nature of people on the site from pushing people away. It's hard. How would I do it if I were to be getting into it now? I dispute slightly that someone who's new to programming couldn't answer questions on it. Because you can try, like, if it's what's a good place to start is in a particularly small piece of technology that isn't very popular yet, because then there just isn't there aren't complex questions coming in about it. There are more basic questions. So, for example, when I got started on Android, there just weren't that many people asking about Android on Stack Overflow. So it made a good opportunity to like jump in, even though I didn't know that much about Android, to like answer questions about it there. I think another thing is just to keep in mind that being downvoted on Stack Overflow is not the end of the world. Like, it is a thing that people do to you, but it is not like, instead of becoming personally offended by it, it's better to understand why someone might have done that and then like try to adjust whatever your question or answer is next time based on that. But yes, that's hard. It's definitely a hard problem because it's one of those things where it's like, oh, it's easy to say to get into it now, but it might have been easier a decade ago than it is now. But yeah, that's why I haven't spent as much time on Stack Overflow, because now that Android has become such a large project, most of the questions that end up on Stack Overflow are very complicated and sort of involve lots like complicated answers, and don't really have time for that. It was a lot more interesting when it was much more basic questions that were being asked. And then the answers to those could be pretty easily researched, and you could derive a much more fundamental understanding of the platform from just being on the site, seeing those current questions and answers.
Well,
Yeah, thank you very much.
I guess if no one has any more questions,
yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine calling it early. One of the things I say in tech for advice on tech talks is like, no one ever complains about a tech talk being short. They complain when you get up and you talk for 2 hours about nothing. But if you can get your point across in less time, that's fine. Everyone likes getting their time back in a day.
Awesome.
Yes,
Well, yeah, I'd just like to thank, on behalf of everyone attending this webinar and for everyone at Microverse, so much. Thank you, Daniel, for making your time available to us. And yeah, thanks a lot.
Yep. I hope you all enjoyed.
all right, guys. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us. Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye.